So this is week 9, and we're recording this up to the cloud so that people who come later can watch the recording and maybe ask Claudio a question via email. So we're delighted to be at the halfway or just beyond the halfway point of this course. We've had many guests leading us to this topic because we had active learning spaces a couple of weeks ago, as you know, and it was a great conversation that we had. And last week, a conversation about mindfulness and creativity. And, you know, really that emphasis on spaces for learning, places for learning, creativity, innovation is really something that I think Claudio's been dealing with, wrestling with, and finding solutions for. And so Claudio Muca is coming to us from Denmark, where he's an architect who's involved in things, lifelong learning and getting us into different kinds of learning spaces so that we can flourish, so our productivity can rise. So in fact, we enjoy our learning spaces, that they're meaningful and relevant to us. And so he's designed many, and I hope he can show us some of them. And that in turn will inspire conversations once we see them. But, you know, he has a project or initiative called WISE, which is to bridge the ongoing and rapid change in the different sectors of the workforce or workspace and education that informs the design of buildings that stimulate learning and innovation. And he's very interested in psychology of these learning spaces, whether it's cognitive psychology or behavioral psychology or just visualization. And so, you know, I don't want to steal his thunder. I want to let him present. But Claudio, could you kind of give us some of the background that led to you in this space? And actually, you contacted me a year ago, and I, said maybe next year we kind of bring you into this particular class. This is a class on learning environment design. And so students are, for their final projects, thinking about designing innovative spaces for learning. And I think what you're going to present and what you're going to talk about today can have a huge impact on those designs and on different iterations of those designs beyond this class, when they actually are serving on committees for their respective schools or universities or companies. They can reflect back on what you have to say today and go back to the notes that they'll take on what you have to say today, and that will influence and impact their contributions. So I don't look at this as just a 1-hour session with you. I look at this as something that people who attend it or might watch this later can think about this beyond this class, in the real world, where they're going to be working, where they currently are working, and how they can make an impact with it. So that's why I've been looking forward to this particular episode. But Claudio, you want to introduce yourself, your team that you have there, and what you've been working on. And then I think you're going to show us a few things.
Absolutely. So yeah, I really hope that what I'm going to talk about today will have an impact on the students. And yeah, I just want to say one more time, thank you so much for this. It's really an honor to be able to speak virtually together into different sides of the world. And I think you're going to see the light out of my window slowly disappear, because I think at 7 here it's already dark. But I have already gathered some slides, so maybe I can share the screen if you're okay with that, so then I can just speak with some images on the background. Is that okay?
It's okay. Let me double check with my students. Do you hear him okay? Everyone does? Okay, just want to make sure. And so if you do have any problems, do put a note in the chat window. If you have at any point can't see something, can't hear it properly, let us know. Go ahead, Claudio.
So, right, can you see my screen?
Yep.
It's just white for now. All right, so this is just to say that I'm originally from Albania, which is a country here very close to Italy. And when I was 12, I moved with my family to Italy, and I studied there. I studied at Politecnico di Milano. I studied architecture, and I became very interested about schools and actually learning during my education as an architect. So my master thesis was actually called Open Schools. Back in 2017, I tried to basically explore how different theories from psychology and how different basically heroes in a way outside of architecture could influence my design. This is just a quick graphic to say that I tried to take all of the components of architecture, very basic components like the walls, the doors, floors, the stairs, the corridors, the rooms, and then I tried to inform them with theories and with learnings and with findings outside of architecture. Because in a way, what I found was that architects were very like looking into their own circle and not looking so much outside of their own field. But I became very, very passionate about looking outside the field of architecture. And once I finished my master thesis, which I co-developed also while I was working at Zebra as an intern, which is the office I work now in Denmark, they were very interested in continuing this master thesis in a research project or in a project that is then called WISE. So WISE stands for Work Innovation Space Education. It's an acronym. And this research project was basically the reason why I moved to Denmark from Italy. That basically had the goal, or still has the goal, to connect the dots between different disciplines. I had to interview different real estate leaders of some of the most profitable companies like LinkedIn, Pinterest, and also academics in fields like neuroscience and cognitive psychology. Then we tried to explore all of these people had to say in relation to architecture. So how can we intentionally design spaces that can enhance productivity, learning, innovation, creativity, and so on. So WISE is it's a continuous exploration. We call it like a curiosity maze, where we gather all of these findings and we inspire ourselves at the company here. But we've also shared this book. You know, we've shared it for a very small cost. It's just like €9, I think, which is almost like $9. And the reason why we put the cost or like the price in it is to say that this publication has a value, but we've shared it for free with most of our network anyway. So we have two versions of publication, one which is for free, and I'm also going to share it with you at the end anyways. But it's just very important to share these curiosities that we've gathered, because that's the way we can then influence people outside of our company. And as I said, I started to work here in Denmark, basically in two initiatives. One was the WISE research publication, the other one is Common Sense, which is basically a technology startup inside the architecture company that uses sensors and data to find out how people move in the buildings, where do they stay the most, basically tracking, of course, anonymously, people's behavior, and then trying to correlate that with our findings that we found while interviewing all of these people from the academia, but also from the real estate companies. And these are just some of those products that came out from the tech startup, which is is a booking app and the sensors, and also an advanced survey that we used to gather data also in that way. Very quickly, I'm going to show you some projects of the company I work for, just to give you a basic introduction about that as well. This is one of the most famous ones, which is called the Iceberg, and it's in Denmark, even though the weather here does not look Danish at all. And the other one is the Science Center in Copenhagen, also with this very playful staircase in the middle, which gathers people around and makes people bump into each other. That's another photo. But we also work internationally, like this project in the Middle East, in Abu Dhabi, that basically requalified the whole city center of Abu Dhabi in a new way, in offering public spaces to people, spaces where people can gather, and so on. Also, we worked in Canada. This is an instructional center, actually, for the Toronto University. It's an instructional center that has 21 classrooms. And all of these classrooms are different. I'm going to show you some specifics about this project later. It's just one of them. And the last project we have is just this tower that we won in Albania as well. But back to the topic of the day, which is what interests me the most. And I hope I can inspire as many as you as possible. There is this very famous quote in the architecture, especially in environmental psychology and architecture, where they intersect, from Winston Churchill, that says, "We shape our buildings, and thereafter they shape us." And this says a lot about the power of architecture. But in a way, I wanted to go deeper with WISE into this. So I want to say, but how do our buildings shape us? How do they influence us? This is like the main question of this investigation. Also, we like, when we speak with our clients, we like to focus a lot on well-being. And we say that, because we hear a lot of clients speak about cost per square meter all the time, but we say that, please, can we focus a little bit more on well-being per square meter? Because at the end of the day, you know that 90% of your costs are actually the cost coming from your staff in a company. So having your staff in a situation of well-being, where they thrive and they are productive, is going to be the same as fitting for cost square meter anyways. It's just to focus more on the human part of it. And one of the main findings of this curiosity maze, when it has to do with learning and the physical spaces, and how much the physical environment influences learning in our gathering of these findings, comes from a professor called Peter Barrett from the University of Salford. Maybe you've heard about him. He made this huge research in, I think it lasted 5 years, in hundreds of schools in the UK, where he tried to basically grasp how much does the physical environment count, how much does the classroom count in terms of the learning progress. And what he found out is that for 1 year only, the physical environment of the classroom can explain 16% of the learning progress in the students. And this is in the setting of primary and secondary schools. Then Professor Barrett tried to then list what are these factors, the architectural factors, the environmental factors in the physical environment that are responsible for this impact. And then you divide them in 2 spheres. On the left side, there is aspects that have to do more with the actual physical space, like the complexity of it, the colors, and so on. And on the other half are aspects that have to do with the climate, for example, the lighting, the temperature, and the air quality, and so on. But with WISE, we wanted to go even deeper. We want to dive even deeper into these parameters, into these architectural qualities. What are these qualities? And we have gathered them in 5 points, just because we like the number 5 points, because it refers to Le Corbusier, which is this architect that also created the 5 points of architecture. It's just a funny way to do it. And these 5 points are diversity, atmospheres, active learning, nature, and movement. So basically, I'm going to go now into each of these points. I'm going to try to say and to showcase how does architecture impact the way we learn, the way we think, the way we feel, and basically our memory, our behavior, and so on. So the first point is diversity. And basically, we believe that buildings are more interesting when they are not, where they don't offer the same qualities all over them. Where the classrooms are not all the same, where the ceiling heights are not all the same, where the interior is not all looking alike, but where they are diverse. This is a very important point. So that's why this is point number 1. And we are very convinced about this, and we have tried to gather basically research and findings that can back up our intuition about why buildings are more beneficial and more interesting when they are diverse. One of these findings is this one. It comes from the University of Minnesota. Maybe you are familiar with it, but for most of the people in Europe, we are not. It's basically, it turns out that just the ceiling height in a building can make a huge difference in the way we think. And in particular, high ceilings were found to promote creative skills in people, whereas low ceiling environments make us think more rationally. And there has been multiple analysis of why this happens, also with brain scanning and so on. So I think it's very fascinating to look into it deeper if you are interested. And in the WISE publication, you can find more about it. We even interviewed Professor Oshin D'Artagnan, that has looked into people's brains while they're looking at spaces with different ceiling heights. This is one of our buildings, which is an adult education center, which plays with different ceiling heights. These overlapping balconies basically create spaces with single height, double height, triple height, and offer different, very diverse environmental qualities in terms of acoustics, in terms of lights, in terms of basically the amount of square meters you have around you, so you feel more protected or you feel more exposed in certain areas. And we know from environmental psychology that people basically have different preferences when it comes to spaces, also in terms of learning. Most of us, or not most of us, but some of us prefer spaces that are more confined, more with dim light, a bit more quiet, and other people prefer spaces that are more open. They prefer to study in groups, in teams, rather than alone. So by providing this diversity of spaces, you then give the opportunity to the students to choose the space that resonates the most with the way they are and the way they learn. Because deeply we believe that people are all different, and this difference needs to be celebrated in our buildings and not hidden. This is one very big thing for us. Another interesting finding is that basically it turns out that dim spaces where there is dim illumination are basically responsible for enabling our creative performance. And this might seem in contrast with what we said before about lower ceilings, but in reality, this finding has nothing to do with the ceiling height, but it has more to do with the fact that when you are in a dim space, you feel less observed by other people. So it has to do with like the being in a dark room and feeling less observed, and that feeling of being less observed makes you think more out of your constraints in a way. So it's also very interesting to think about just the light quality in a room and not just necessarily the volume of the room. We also know that a stimulating environment, so an environment that's diverse and offers some degree of complexity, is responsible for even driving the brain development. So there is this study made on rats that basically compared rats that spend their life in cages that were very empty, without anything, and then other rats spend their lives in cages that were more interesting, toys and slides that they could engage with. And after some years, those rats that spent their lives in an environment that was more complex and offered different activities they could do, their brain was actually bigger in size compared to the rats that spend their life in very monotonous cages, in very empty cages. And we also know that in terms of preference, people prefer spaces that encourage exploration. So we prefer spaces that offer some degree of mystery, that make us want to go a little bit further, and instead of us grasping them immediately as soon as we see the space. This is just in terms of preferences. And the second point is atmosphere. So it's going one level further into the diversity of spaces. So now we speak about how to make these spaces different. Are they just different in terms of metrics, in terms of ceiling heights, in terms of volumes, or should we speak also about materials? Should we speak also about the flavor of these rooms? And we believe so. And one of the reasons why we believe that spaces should have different atmospheres is this theory that's called context-dependent memory. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, but I just want to bring it here anyways. Basically, context-dependent memory, in a very simple way explained by an architect, means that we tend to remember more the information that we have received in a room, if that room is the same room that we're trying to recall the information. So in a simple way, it means that the experience of learning something gets somehow attached to the rooms of the space. So if you imagine this building for the University of Toronto, we then said, why don't we make all of the classrooms, all of the 21 classrooms different, with different atmospheres? So the learning experience that the students will have in one classroom will be very different than the learning experience they'll have in the other classrooms. And as they move from classroom to classroom, they will then recall what happened to them while they were in that classroom. So it provides a context for the learning experience to kind of get stuck in the walls and into the atmosphere of that room, almost like visual cues. So I'm going to speak a little bit more about this building later, but we're just very inspired by theories and findings outside architecture, and this is one of them. These are some of the rooms in that building. As you can see, they go from 500 seat rooms to 200 collaborative rooms, and also to more smaller, basically classrooms for group work and so on. But our main goal was to make them all different, to offer something different for students, and not offer the same catalog of rooms that they have in the already old, not old, but existing buildings they already study on. We're also very fascinated by this word, which is called alesthesia, which basically means that humans tend to feel basically a sensation of pleasure when they are exposed to contrasting sensations. A simple example is when you are at the beach during a hot day and you have a cold breeze in your face. So that contrasting sensation is responsible for generating a sensation of pleasure in us. So we think that that is basically another reason why we like to create these rooms with different atmospheres, because when students will go from one room to another, then they'll receive another sensation. They will receive a contrasting sensation from the atmosphere of this room, and that will be responsible for them basically receiving some pleasure sensations as they move from these different rooms. Another reason why we love to speak about the wider palette of atmospheres in our buildings is because we are convinced that we need to celebrate people's differences, and one of those differences is people's personalities. So we have different personalities. Of course, this is a gradient. We are not all extroverts and all introverts and all ambiverts, but it's a gradient. But we know that even though there is this gradient, we know that some of us react very highly to stimuli, and usually it's introverts, whereas extroverts are found to react less to stimuli. I think Susan Cain explains this very well in her book called Quiet, which I really love, and it made me think a lot about how little it is spoken about this during an architect's job. But anyways, so by offering this wider palette of spaces, some of them that are very stimulating in terms of noise and colors and so on, but others may be more calm, more neutral. We believe that this will tap into people's different preferences in terms of how they react to the stimuli and so on. But we also love to speak about the fact that when we create an environment that resonates with the topic that is being taught in that space, we know that basically students tend to remember more if they receive the information in a space that looks like what they're actually learning about. This is what we call a meaningful environment. So now I'm gonna go a little bit deeper into how we can use basically the stimulation of the whole sensory apparatus of the users of a building to basically influence the contrasting sensations in them, and how can we use not only the visual stimuli but also all of our senses. In this case, we have created a diagram which links different scents, different basically smells with effects that they generate in people. We're very fascinated about basically stimulating all of our senses, touch, scent, and so on. And this is just to say that there is a whole world that I think can be inspiring for architects to bring into the discussion when we design spaces that go beyond the basically the usual visual aspect of our buildings and of our spaces. We know that, for example, peppermint has has been correlated with more enhancing performance when it comes to alertness, but even physical performance, whereas other scents like lavender have more the opposite effect of providing relaxation and even drowsiness in some cases. When it comes to the impact of daylight and light, of course, there is tons of research about how important daylight is in our buildings, and especially in Denmark, where there is a lack of daylight. Here it's basically paramount that there should be as much daylight as possible in the building. So we've gone a little bit deeper and trying to see, okay, what is there more beyond the impact of daylight? So we've also found this research from a PhD students from Greece that studied in actually Lausanne. She found out that windows and facades that offered intricate patterns that were more organic, basically were responsible for reducing the heart rate of people. She investigated this with VR headsets. So it's just another point that speaks about the hidden power of architecture. Some of these things we'll never know some years ago. And I think it's interesting to bring them now into the discussion. Another study from Denmark found out that just the simple act of substituting the industrial ceiling lamps in a classroom with low pendants was responsible for reducing the noise in the classroom. So basically, students started speaking with a lower voice just by changing the type of lamp that was around their tables. And again, when we speak about other senses like touch, another interesting finding is that when we're sitting in a soft chair, we tend to be more flexible in our negotiations. This is just a fun fact to bring into the table. And even more, when we are in a negative mood, we actually crave for soft materials. And this is linked to our mammalian roots. Basically, this research explains that this correlation in a way that when we were unable to think as very young mammals, our sensations will basically turn into, if there was a situation of danger, we would crave more for tactility, so that we could find protection in our mothers. Whereas if we felt in a situation of safety, we would feel more basically our sense of vision, so that we could explore the territory by ourselves if we felt safe. So it's very interesting to also dive deeper in why we crave for soft materials when we're in a negative mood. The third point is active learning. Just want to make sure that I can stay in your time frame. So I think it's good. Active learning is basically a big thing for us at the office where I work. And of course, it's a big thing also for Professor Bong. And so I don't want to speak to you too much about active learning, but I want to speak maybe more about some of the spaces that promote active learning. Even though I have some slides here that speak about active learning, and I'm sure you know them, but basically learning through frontal lectures or traditional lectures, students are 50% more likely to fail. You know that. And when students are in sessions with active learning, they actually learn more than what they think. I think you also know this, but for us it was very kind of like an eye-opener, because it basically said that when students were asked if they learned more in an active learning session, they said no, we learned more in a traditional way. But when they were tested, it turns out that they actually learn more during active learning. So so the explanation was that students feel uncomfortable during active learning, so they prefer passive learning. They think they learn more during passive learning, but the reality is not that. So just really, really interesting for us as architects to bring that into a discussion with our clients as well. Again, when we speak about active learning, we are very inspired by some of these stories that actually come from the business world. And this is a story that comes from Pixar, a company that is known for its creativity, and so on. I'm sure some of you might be familiar with the book Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull, which I really recommend. So basically, in this book, it's described a situation where the Pixar directors would meet around the table, and this table was very long. And what happened is that as they were meeting in this long table, the people in the center had more power. Just like naturally, it created more power around them, and the people at the edge of this table almost never contributed during the brainstorming of the movies and during the critics of their movies. But one day they moved into another room that had a round table, and just moving into this other room, it was incredible how the dynamics of this group changed, how much the ideas started to be more free-flowing, and the eye contact was automatically go between all of these people. So just the fact of changing a meeting room table changed so much of what was happening during their meetings. So this is very, very powerful for us. Also, we know that from a learning point of view, when sitting in a semicircle, students were found to ask more questions rather than when they were sitting in rows. And we also know something that's called the Steinzer effect, which basically says that you are more likely to receive a response or to engage in a conversation with the person sitting in front of you rather than with the person sitting next to you. I'm sure you're also very familiar with this. I'm going to show you now one example of a classroom that we were asked to design for the University of Toronto building that I showed you before. This was in the brief. They wanted a 500-seat lecture hall, which we thought was pretty interesting to say. And we tried to steer the discussion of this classroom into another direction, which was, can we make it a round auditorium instead? Because we were not happy, first of all, with the distance of the students sitting in the last rows to the presenter. And also, we were not sure if this will be a classroom where you could engage in discussions, or if it will be more a classroom for traditional passive learning. So what we said instead was, can we make a configuration that brings students closer to the instructor? Can we make a configuration that brings students closer to the screens and brings students closer to each other? So maybe they can see each other in their eyes as they're trying to engage into a conversation. And luckily we ended up going for this layout instead of the other one. And here is just a visualization. It's not there. It's under construction yet, the project. So I really look forward to see it done. But we also had just a side note here was that some of the teachers were uncomfortable to sit in or to stand in the center of this classroom. So we had to find a solution where this podium was on rails, so it could move and go to the edge or to the end of the flat space in the middle, and then the students could sit more like in a horseshoe layout, and other chairs would then have to bring back into the back of the room. So this room will work in both ways. Will work as a round auditorium, but will also work as a horseshoe auditorium. I think this flexibility was very important to get everyone on board. So something to keep in mind is that if you can create a room that offers more than one setting, that will have like an extra gear. Another room for the same building from the brief was supposed to be what they call the collaborative room, a collaborative lecture hall. And the example was something like this, with a table in the middle and then students facing each other in groups of 4. But again, the room had also to function as a traditional lecture hall as well. So the students were still needed to see the blackboard here and the instructor. We could imagine how uncomfortable it would be for some of them sitting in this layout to turn their head and basically see the presentations here. So we tried to propose another layout for this room as well. We tried to say, can we create a classroom that still offers the opportunity for traditional lectures, but also for group work? Can we create a classroom that provides an extra layer to it in terms of how you work together in groups? And this is again a very how to say, like it's just a visualization of what is going to be built, and it will be much more detailed. It's not so detailed, it's rendered, but it shows, in any case, it shows some features that we're very happy about to have brought into the discussion, which is now students will sit together in these booths that have, first of all, softer materials. And you can imagine in a classroom that's supposed to be for collaborative learning, you can imagine a lot of students speaking together. And you can imagine how important it is to have acoustics that can absorb the sound and the noise that will be generated in this room. So we believe that by using this sort of layout with softer materials and with booths, the acoustics of the room will be dramatically enhanced.
Claudio, this is very cool. That room is very cool. I would love to teach in a room like that. You know, I've got many notes when you're done. I've got several other comments, but this one I just had to stop you for a second, just say, this had to cost extra money to build something like with a double design like this. So you could be doing lectures and having group work almost simultaneously or back to back seamlessly. You know, is this a really expensive design?
I think the point of this project that we are doing in Canada was that they had a lot of rooms that were alike, and with this building they wanted something new. They wanted to extend their catalog of rooms. So when we proposed this, I think it was very well received. Strangely, we had a lot of other discussions for other rooms, but not for this one. I think this one was loved by almost all of the stakeholders.
Who is they? What place is this? A university?
It's the University of Toronto at Scarborough.
It is okay. It is Toronto again. Okay, yeah, you're still on Toronto. Great. I've got a comment on that too. Go ahead. I just wanted to just pause you for a second and just say, all my students should be looking at this space when you're designing your final project and just saying how, you know, this seems to solve a lot of problems that we have in education today, spaces like this, I would think. You know, and the other room, that theater and around as well, with multifunctionality and multiple designs, and the horseshoe shape versus the theater and around shape also solves a lot of problems. And all of these are interesting spaces to be able to teach within and learn within. So this is really exciting. Have you compiled all these spaces into a book of some kind that we could buy, or
No, sadly no, because there is so much to do, and I also work as an architect where I design actually buildings, so the time is very limited to produce also material. I would be happy to share with you all of the specifications of these rooms, and if it can be of any inspiration.
Yeah, this is fantastic. You can keep going. I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't want to interrupt.
If you want, I can speak more about this room. I can speak forever about this room because I was involved directly in designing it. I think what happened is that the aisles became also much more generous. So it's much more comfortable to walk in between these rows once we introduce this sort of layout. And also it creates a sort of intimate atmosphere within the table. And we are also thinking about providing lamps, individual lamps for each of the tables, almost like, I think what we spoke about was the atmosphere of a jazz club, where you're attending a live jazz performance or something like that. So,
wow.
Yeah.
When you had the original picture of the building up, I said that's Toronto. Before you even said University of Toronto, I said I spoke at Ryerson University, and they had a similar room at Ryerson. It's not too far from the University of Toronto, and in designs, and we got a tour of the active learning spaces in that. So must be something interesting happening in Toronto, because it's not just at the University of Toronto. But anyways, yeah, go ahead.
Yes. I have 20 minutes left. Yeah, this is just to say that when we speak about active learning, we also would like to focus on something else, which is deep work, and which is how important it is for us to provide spaces where students would just be by themselves also and be active by themselves, not necessarily active with others. And we really recognize this ability as being very important in today's society. That's a clickbait society. So we want our buildings and our spaces to provide room for people to dive into the information more than just reading headlines. And also because we know that it takes an average 23 minutes to focus after you are being interrupted on average. So this is a fun diagram that we like to bring sometimes into the table, which is basically saying that can we imagine certain spaces or a building where spaces go from being like a gallery to a saloon to an office and then a library and then chambers. So where degrees of noise and privacy go basically via a gradient to becoming more and more and more private, more and more and more quiet, more and more and more basically, yeah, deep for deep work. And it's a concept that we've borrowed from another architect, which is called David Delawain, and he calls it the eudaimonia machine. If you are interested, you can search that as well. So the fourth point has to do with nature. We know that nature has so many benefits in terms of restoring our stress and in enabling our creative thinking and so on. So from studies in hospitals, we know that patients heal faster when they're looking outside a window with nature compared to looking out of a window with a brick wall. This is just a really famous study in buildings that have to do with health. And we also know that when you are immersed in nature, basically this immersion promotes restoration and creativity in people. So some of these findings are very famous when it has to do with nature. So I'm not going to dwell too much around them. But also in terms of sick days, nature has a huge impact in terms of employees reporting fewer sick days when they had the view of nature and the high daylight quality in the buildings. But we also love to speak about natural settings. So is there something there in nature that basically made us feel safer? And it turns out that there is a condition which is called prospect and refuge. It's this condition where you have a vast view ahead of you, but you feel somehow protected from your back. And when you are in this condition, what happens is you feel safe. And this safety could be tracked back to our days in the savannah and how important it was for us to feel safe in our back and have a vast view ahead. And it's important to sometimes stop and think, is this building offering now a condition of prospect and refuge? Is this platform offering this? Is this shared space offering this? And yeah, that's what this is also a snapshot from the University of Toronto common area where students can just chat and socialize together. The last point is movement. We know that when walking, creativity increased by 60%. And by the way, these are just findings. These are just inspirational findings. This is what Y is about. It's a curiosity maze. And we also know that just 20 minutes of walking increases our cognitive processing. And there is two other reasons why we love to speak about the importance of walking and promoting walking in our buildings. One is that in an environment where innovation is so important and where creativity is so important, we know that bumping into people that you are not usually surrounded yourself with, it's so much more important for getting the creative breakthrough than meeting people that you are surrounded every day. This is what Mark Granovetter calls weak ties and strong ties. And this sociologist has basically spoken about the importance of weak ties and the importance of these basically meetings with people that we are not usually surrounded by every day. So we tend to promote walking in our, we love to promote walking in our buildings so that we can increase the chances of people bumping into each other and bumping with colleagues that they don't usually interact with. And the last fun fact is that when walking side by side, we tend to synchronize with each other, and that synchronization is basically found to increase social bonding. And we can think about Steve Jobs, how much he loved to have walking meetings, and Obama and other people like that. So I think that was it for my presentation. And with this QR code, you can download the WISE publication for free, just by going into this website. You can get it. Thank you.
Everybody, a big round of applause. So we've got probably tons of questions for you. First one, just real briefly, I had the 5 points. I just wrote the first 3: diversity and atmosphere and active learning. What were the next 2? The last 2?
Nature and movement.
Nature and movement, right? Okay. I will say that my students have read or had the opportunity to read from Ed Catmull, the Creativity Inc. We discussed that a little bit a couple of weeks ago. So that's one that has been part of this. The Susan Cain book, Quiet, we haven't looked at. I could try and get a synopsis on that one too. I had the privilege of meeting her a decade ago, and actually in the makeup room, before our respective keynote, we were invited for the same conference once. So yeah, I got to read it. She's a lawyer who got into the psychology. You're an architect who got into the psychology of learning.
Yeah.
The same kind of thing. Later in life, you're looking at Howard Gardner's work on multiple intelligence. I saw in here David I think it's David Thornburg's work you had in here too. Who's been in the field forever. I'm curious. You mentioned psychologists. You went over that part kind of fast. Can you tell us a couple of the other psychologists or educational psychologists who you've read and who your work is based on? Who my students should be looking at and reading as well?
Well, that's a very, very good question, and I'll just think about it. And the most recent one that I can think about is Professor Steve Jordan's, that I had the pleasure of working with together for the University of Toronto. Yeah, he was very inspiring to me, because we had a concrete case to deal with. So I think something very important is to basically have something very concrete, something very tangible, and then discuss it with someone that's outside of your sphere of knowledge. So with Steve Jordan's, we spoke a lot about transferable skills. That's something that he was very passionate about, and he explains in a very simple way. And also he makes the analogy of Kung Fu architecture, which basically is to say that you can study everything about Kung Fu, you can know all of the theory about Kung Fu, but the only way to do Kung Fu is to basically practice and practice Kung Fu, and actually go and do the actual thing, and not just study the theory behind it. And it's the same with our buildings and with what I'm saying here today. These are all very inspiring things, but what is more important is to actually apply these into buildings and to have concrete data and concrete examples on how these things have actually impacted the users. And also another psychologist is Oshin Vartanian, Professor Oshin Vartanian. His work is centered around the impact of curvature and how people basically respond differently to spaces with curved basically features rather than angular features. That's also was very inspiring, and he also investigated the impact of ceiling heights and, as I said, round shapes. And he's also very inspiring to me because he loves to divide people into two groups, architects and non-architects. So he has investigated how architects respond to architecture and how normal people respond to architecture. Because as architects, we are trained to see things in a certain way, but not everyone can see what architects can see in a building. So I think that's also very fascinating to see the differences between how people respond to architecture when they are architects, when they're trained architects, and when they're not.
So I'll interrupt. This will be my only other question for now. I'll let my students ask questions after this. It's really more of a comment, and then we can open up. Bo, by the way, do we have a Jamboard for this or not? Bo?
Yes, I'll share the link again, but I did earlier as well. So
how many questions are in the Jamboard, or are there any at this point?
None yet.
Okay, so I'll make my comment here. So I've been at many universities around the world. I'm some massive spaces and very elegant ones in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and so forth. But I went to Glasgow Caledonian University in Glasgow, where they built a new building for student teaching and learning, and every level of the building was a different type of learning. So more socialized learning on the first floor, more collaborative learning on the second floor, more individual learning on the third floor, and then one-to-one counseling on the fourth floor. And actually there's a place where you could, on the top of the building, where you would say what's happening in the building that day. There's like a text scrolling across some glass panes. So if you're a plane flying above, you could see what's happening in that space at Glasgow Caledonian that day or that week. That was kind of interesting. Well, similarly is Yonsei University's library in Seoul, Korea. Yonsei is the top private university in Seoul, and they have it's all elegant buildings all throughout. And they have like a bowl on this in Chicago Cubs Stadium. It's ivy right on the side. It's all, so Yonsei is all ivy, on the sides of the building. And the same thing there is very social games, learning language games on the first floor, and then collaborative learning, and then individual learning and so forth. So they designate different floors of the building for things. And the third place I'll point out is University of Adelaide, where they got like a huge amount of money. It was a $500 million or something to redesign learning spaces. And they put students on the team, and the students helped design the spaces for learning. And they had a lot of comfortable spaces in that facility. And again, they had different rooms. They didn't have each floor wasn't a different kind of learning. They had different rooms that represented a different kind of learning, whether it's collaborative or individual or just wellness and sleeping and just hanging out. And I remember going there, and after my keynote, checking out these spaces and interviewing students about it, I did not want to leave. I set myself down in a particular room. I said, wow, I just want to be here. So they created a building, I forgot the name now, where you just wanted to go there. It's called the Innovation Hub, I think. And it's just someplace you wanted to hang out in. So if you would like to comment on any of those things that I've observed, and have you built similar rooms with input from students and so forth? Would you like to comment, Claudio?
Absolutely. I have a lot of thoughts that just are being generated right now. So I'll start from the last ones, which is what you said, this innovation hub. It was a space that you wanted to go. I think for us, it's so important that we can create something where people would like to go, especially, I can think also in terms of work environments. Some of our clients, they just want an office where their employees can go to work and not stay and work from home, because how important it is for people to work together. So I think if we can find the secret source of what's a building that is this magnet that attracts you to go there, I think that would be like a huge achievement for the architecture community. And I'm sure it's different from side to side and from country to country. what these qualities of this building are probably different, but there are also some similarities. And I think one of these similarities is this variety, and I can see it in all the three examples that you mentioned, that there is a variety, there is an offering, there is a possibility of choosing what resonates the most with you. And I think so far, if I think back at my university in Milano, there was a lack of choice. There was a lot of rooms for collaborative learning. There was a lot of spaces, just empty spaces with tables. There was a lot of that, but what was missing, for example, was a space where I can just be by myself. Maybe this self-directed learning. I think those spaces that I also spoke about before, deep work and so on, were kind of neglected in that situation. But I love the idea of also putting them in different floors, because this is a very common question we have in almost every building: is how would you divide the functions and the faculties or the classrooms between floors? And I think the idea of putting them floor by floor made me think, sorry for the fast scrolling, made me think about this diagram here, which is the money machine diagram, which you go from a very open space to slowly spaces that are more quiet and more private. So I think there is something special about providing a transition and a fade from noisy to quiet and from individual to collaborative and so on. And even in this other project I showed you before, maybe it can be seen a bit here. Even here, what we did is that we placed the spaces that were more quiet in the perimeter of the building, at the edge of the building, and the spaces that were more noisy and more collaborative were at the center of the building. So here the gradient is both vertically, also vertically. In the ground floor, there is more cafeteria and more social spaces, and in the higher floors, it's more quiet spaces for self-directed work and concentration. But even horizontally, the spaces are sort of like have this gradient of quiet to noisy. I think it's very interesting to speak about that, or to discuss it together. How do we put these functions together? How do we basically connect them in 3 dimensions?
Yeah. So I forgot to mention that University of Adelaide's in Australia. If you're not familiar with that, any of my students haven't heard of Adelaide. That's in the wine country of southeast Australia. So we do have a question in the Jamboard. Before we go to the question in the Jamboard, does anyone want to ask the first question of Claudio? Anyone can jump in. Yeah, go ahead, Evan. Evan's in the Coast Guard here in the USA. Evan, go ahead.
Hey, Claudio. So it seems like you're basically creating a utopia for learning environments, which is great. And I see a lot of your work is designed around larger institutions or education systems. I was wondering, as I sit here online, if any of your design or any of your studies or any of your work is for anybody for at-home online learning. I kind of like, as you were going through your slides, I was thinking about where I'm sitting currently. You typically have your 2 monitors or screens, but everything around me could potentially be manipulated to help create, a higher level of thinking. And I was just wondering if there's been any study or if you've ever developed anything in regards to that.
Yeah. We haven't developed anything in particular for that, but I think a lot of the stuff that we're discussing here today sort of like apply beyond the institutional spaces. I think a lower, higher ceiling, a dim light, a prospect refuge space can easily be achieved at home as well, or anywhere. So I think because of what happened after the Corona pandemic, because of how important it became to speak about your space at home or spaces everywhere in the world, and not just your typical workspace. I think right now we are more and more asked to think about those kind of environments, but there hasn't been an occasion where we have thought about it before. I have to say there's been a lot of emphasis and focus on the actual schools and the actual rooms, not so much about what happens to you when you are attending from home or from anywhere. but I know that how much of how important it is this question, because there is even universities that don't have a campus anymore. There is Minerva University, for example. They just have this active learning form online, which is amazing, and it's one of the most difficult universities to get in. And they have a residential campus. They have that campus where students live together. But I'm curious to know how much this residential campus of Minerva University is actually, it's actually basically put emphasis in instead of the online platform, because as an architect, I see more the physical spaces, which is very biased and not good necessarily. But I know that they've invested a lot into the active learning platform online. I don't know how much they've invested into the residential campus and how the spaces look. What qualities do they provide when the students are attending online?
Thank you.
Yeah. Claudio, could you maybe stop sharing your screen for a minute? You can always go back to it, I think, so we can see everyone who's here. Yeah.
I'll share. Stop sharing.
Stop share. There we go. So who's got the question on the Jamboard?
I didn't really have a question. I just wanted to express agreement in everything that he was sharing. Just so you know, my background is psychology. So a lot of the things that I think of when I guess, choose the classrooms, if I have that opportunity to choose them to teach in, it's largely based on what you're saying. And like when you were talking about the soft spaces, people crave them. And I was thinking immediately like of Harlow and attachment and how it feels safe and things like that. But I shared in our discussion board, I think it was in week 7, and I wrote a reflection because I missed the speaker that week for the active spaces in higher ed, but my favorite places on campus are very much like you've said, full of windows, and they bring nature in. Our campus is quite, I would say, pretty. We are very rural, so we have a lot of woodland creatures that if you have a window in your classroom, it's not uncommon to have furry friends outside, deer or whatever. So it really just adds to the atmosphere, and I think it helps with the flexible seating and all of the windows. Just, it really helps, I guess, for my classes, bring out more conversation and interaction in the classroom. So I was just putting in my 2 cents that I am jiving with what you're putting down.
Thank you so
Christy's in Southwest Michigan at a community college, right? So,
yes.
So the little context there. Does anyone else want to jump in with a comment or a question? Yep, go ahead, Bo.
I was going to try and pull out a couple of the conversations that were in the chat window here. One of the concerns that was expressed regarding the aromas and the scents of the learning environment was like the potential for individuals who have allergies to certain things. What considerations do you put in place for that? And then the second one was regarding the lecture hall collaborative space that Dr. Bonk had you pause on. One of the thoughts on that was that what about those individuals who are more introverted learners, and maybe they want to learn a little more independently and not participate in the collaborative aspect of it as much?
Yes, I'll start from the last one. I think when it comes to the students that are more introverted and would not like to be in a participatory learning, as I said before, I have two thoughts on it, which I think the actual solution will then depend on the case if there is that sort of concern. But as we saw from that finding that I showed from Harvard, students actually learn more during active learning, even though they think they don't, because how uncomfortable it is. So I would say that if I was a teacher, or if this problem was raised, I would try to bring the students into that room anyways, and maybe with the design of the room, somehow help those students feel more comfortable with the way the lighting is, with the materials, provide maybe more softness, as we saw before, that when we're in a negative mood, we crave for softer materials. So maybe use the architecture, use those findings to make this feel more at ease, and so on. Because I don't think the solution necessarily is to leave these people out of that collaborative room, because they are introverts and they can only thrive in spaces that are without others. That's just my as an architect, you know, I'm not an expert in these other fields. I'm just informed and I'm curious about these other fields and I love them, but I'm not an expert. So I don't know what's the right thing to do is, but as an architect, I would try to make them feel comfortable in the room, because I know how important it is to step out of the comfort zone and not always be in the comfort zone, if it was me, you know, to decide. And then the second question with the sense, I know, completely agree that that's why we haven't done any of our buildings with sense that are in the room present, because of how sensitive this topic is and how sensitive people are to different sense and the allergies and so on. It's just the reason why I brought it into this conversation is just to say that, hey, there is also this. We should also know that we are influenced by certain things like peppermint and lavender and so on. And if at any point in the future there will be a room that will be infused with peppermint, and that room you can choose yourself if you want to go there, maybe that would be an added value to a catalog of spaces. But of course, we shouldn't force anyone to go in a space with certain sense, especially if they are not even if they are
Gotcha. The perfect response there. I was when you started sharing that, I started thinking about one of the things that they do at Walt Disney World, which is they try and push out some of the sense of the baking cookies out onto Main Street, USA, to draw some of the guests into the shops and everything. And I thought that was quite a clever way to use the aromas in the business world as well.
Yeah, super interesting.
So I would point out, any student who's in Bloomington, or if you do visit Bloomington, the School of Ed library has been remodeled for active learning, with active learning spaces, with solitary spaces, with collaborative spaces, all that. And they open up the windows are now not hidden by bookshelves. They've taken those bookshelves down and put in this place smaller shelves so that you can actually see out and rest and meditate. And we could actually have a meditation room in there as well. So all sorts of active learning spaces. Our dean was in charge of active learning spaces on our campus for about 10 years, or at least 5. And so she's very much into what we call the Mosaic project for active spaces at all the 9 campuses, but in particular Indianapolis and Bloomington. So do visit. Sao Hung raised her hand. She's down at IU Southeast, down near Louisville. It's in New Albany, Indiana. Sao Hung, and she teaches psychology as well.
Yeah, thank you, Claudio. And I just think your presentation is just so interesting. There's so many points I didn't think of, because we learned about creating the learning environment, but have never thought of, like you say, the scent, the lights, the ceiling. And so I just think that's interesting, very interesting. And I have a question, like, because it seems the examples you presented is more for larger classrooms, like the lecture hall, or the first floor, like the foyer of the building, more larger space. So how will you use those principles to create like a small classroom? Because usually for us, like in the classroom is pretty small, maybe for 25 students. I think the maximum is like 30. So 20 something students, a small classroom. And I know what will you do if you're given like a small classroom, and how to renovate? What will you do?
I would love to show you some of the classrooms that we designed for the University of Toronto, because there was 21 classrooms there, and 7 of those are large. The ones I showed were mostly the large ones, but the other 14, they are all designed with different characteristics and different features. we went out of the box, I would say, with those classrooms and thought of so many different ways of using the corners of the classroom and dividing them in different ways and having all sorts of settings and materials and basically what we did, I would say, is we tried to activate the walls. We tried to basically add a layer to the space that makes students want to stand up and use that wall. So basically, how can we basically use architecture? How can we transform the walls from a white wall, from a wall with a color? How can we add an extra layer to enable active learning? That's what we try to do. We try to add pin boards. We try to add whiteboards where you could write on, create maybe a cozy corner with a more intimate setting, try to play with different carpets and so on to add maybe a more informal atmosphere to the rooms. But yeah, I have 14 rooms that have different iterations that I would love to share with you if you are interested to see them more. It's just diagrammatically designed because we didn't go in full depth, but you can see the idea behind the rooms.
Do you have a slide that you can show us a couple of those rooms available or not?
I think I would have to send it to you because I don't have it here. I can find it, but it will take like 5 minutes or 4 minutes.
Yeah, and I'll say that our library space, we have a room like that with multifunctional capabilities with group work on each wall. It's a smaller room for 25 to 30 students, and you can rotate and utilize different with the movable chairs and movable desks. You can rearrange everything within the room for however you want, and it's a very much a collaborative space, a group space. So next to it is a meditation room for individual learning. So it's a two rooms for one, a two for one. We're doing this, and we have one in one of the oldest buildings on campus is called Woodburn Hall. It has what's called the alcove, and that alcove is where we got the model. We have a meditation room connected to a classroom, and you can rotate groups back and forth or individuals back and forth. So have you created any spaces where there's a 2-for-1, where you have 2 classrooms for one, 2 spaces for one class?
Absolutely. I think when an architect can do that, I think it has an added value. So we try to do that everywhere, even in the common areas. If a waiting area could be also an area for brainstorming, that's awesome. Right. And we've also done what you said, that some of the meeting areas in the faculty environments in the top floor of the University of Toronto building can then become a yoga space or a meditation space in the after hours.
Right. So we don't have a lot of time left. In fact, we're a little bit over, but I think we need to get a couple more questions before we end, if that's okay. Okay, so let's just maybe even just go around the students, people who haven't talked. I would like to at least have you give a comment, everyone at least have a voice today. And so there's only a couple people we haven't heard from yet. Carol was the first one in here today. Have you any comments, Carol?
I was the one who posted the comment about the room with the chairs. That would be a nightmare for the introspect, which is me. So that's all, what I had to say, but this is very interesting. It's hard to apply for online environments, which is my focus, but it's still very interesting information.
Yeah, thank you.
And Carol, thank you. Remind me, are you originally from South America or originally from Portugal?
I am from Brazil.
Brazil, so South America. Okay.
Yeah.
Which is Portuguese. That's why.
Portuguese speaking, but the Portuguese from Portugal don't think we speak Portuguese anymore. It changed. The language changed a lot.
Claudio, you want to make a comment? Claudio's down in Dallas.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for this presentation. I was checking your LinkedIn profile as well and all the different talks that you have given in recently. So this is very, very interesting. And I was wondering what happened with schools that they don't have budget to make those changes. Do you have some recommendations for example, professors or teachers that they have the desks that they can move around, but the administration or the institutions, they don't have the money to make those changes?
Yeah, well, I think I think some of those changes, especially in the smaller rooms, in my opinion, are not as budget intensive, but they might seem like so once you are shown with an image, with a render that that might be very new and very fresh. That might be also a little bit intimidating. But what we try to do in this 14 smaller classrooms of the UTSC building, we try to then decompose them and say, at the end of the day, what we're talking about is just maybe a different paint of the wall where you can write. It's maybe just a different material. So it's not that it's going to be so much more expensive than maybe having a white paint, but it's just a different way of maybe thinking and trying to bring that into the agenda. And also, I love to stress out that part about the well-being per square meter when it comes to speaking about budgets and costs. Like, what about the long-term impact these rooms will have on the students? What about the long-term impact that your buildings, once they're built, you know, it's super hard to change them. So why don't we speak about the well-being now instead of having to redo them in 10 years or 5 years and spend more money then? That's just my answer as an architect and not as a business guy so much.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, there's ways you could probably abide by the principles and yet not have a costly design. And so, you know, again, this could be mapped out where you have, again, if you ever did a book, you know, the low cost options and those that are more intensive budgetarily. So Alicia is my visiting scholar from China, from Shanghai. And every week she asks a thoughtful, deep question. So I'm sure she has something to say here. And then we go to Michelle to end tonight, or may have someone else make a final comment. Alicia?
Okay, and thanks, Claudio. And I think that this lecture is impressive and informative. So I'm curious about your perspective on the following question. So how can architecture design promote accessibility in educational environments, ensuring an equity learning experience for all students, regardless abilities or disabilities? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a really good point about accessibility. And we are, again, in the case of the UTSC building, we have had so many inspiring discussions with the head of the accessibility program, where in some cases, some of these colors that we wanted to use were not actually completely in line with what she had in mind, because the rooms needed to provide enough contrast for people with disabilities, so they could see basically the difference between the floor and the wall. The colors should not be too alike. So we had all of these discussions, how to make the rooms more accessible, and of course with the wheelchair access, that's paramount and fundamental. There is no space in the building that's not accessible by anyone. That's super important to us. But also when we speak about different atmospheres and this wider palette of options, I think I'd love to think that by expanding the palette of stimuli and by providing choice for everyone, then everyone could find their setting. Also with the people with different, basically neurodiverse people that respond different to stimuli, they can find their own setting. Even before, when I said about the introverts having to step out of their comfort zone in that collaborative room, that was just an example in case the instructor wanted them to be in that room. But the idea is that the building should have a space for everyone, should have an environment for everyone to feel comfortable at. And then it's up to the teacher to them, or if the teacher has that authority, or it's up to them to then just feel comfortable. Because nowadays the teacher, in my opinion, and from what I've learned, is more of a guide, is more of a coach. So I think it has that opportunity to guide students around the building instead of just forcing you to go to that room because that's where you should learn. You can learn everywhere, and that everywhere could be as beautiful, as diverse as possible, thanks to architecture.
Thank you for that. Michelle, I'll go. Sahal wanted to make a comment? Do you have your hand up? No, okay. So anyone else want to make a comment? We'll go to Michelle.
Hi, I apologize for being off camera. I'm at work right now, but I really enjoyed this. I know an architect, so this extends the discussions that I can have with that person. I'm an online person as well, and it makes me think about how we could use the principles at hand to maybe offer online learners tips for optimizing their home study spaces using, some sound architecture principles. And like, we can't maybe knock out our roof to or our ceiling to increase our creativity, but what else can we do? That's really enlightening. I also find myself curious about how architecture can demand that extroverts also have to step out of their comfort zones sometimes. There's a lot, I'm an introvert, and there's a lot of talk about how I need to get out of my comfort zone and be more extroverted. And I'm curious about flipping that around and looking at that. Otherwise, I'm the aroma lady. I was a clinical aromatherapy educator for about 8 years. And so I appreciated hearing some discussion about and seeing the research about that. It lines up with what we taught our students. So thank you for today.
Thank you so much.
Claudio?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm also, I think I sometimes feel like an introvert, sometimes like an extrovert. But when I read Susan Skane's book, I just was, everything resonated with me so deeply. So when we speak about these different atmospheres and widening the palette of buildings, I think it's just so important to stress the power of introverts instead of just speaking always about extroverts. And I would love to also speak about what you just suggested, how to make extroverts step out of their comfort zone. I've never thought about that, but I think it's going to be something that I'll have in the back of my head from now on, and try to speak about it and design something about that.
So for the past 3 weeks, and sort of, we've had discussions that relate to the psychology of learning spaces, whether wellness spaces, group interaction spaces, creativity, brainstorming spaces. There's a lot of important research that's been done in psychology that helps us explain the types of learning that can take place, the power of the learning that does take place, and the residual effects. I was in Egypt a few weeks ago at American University of Cairo, and in their new campus, they spent $1 billion approximately building this new campus. I just over and over said to myself, the architects building this campus had to be some of the most talented and creative people in the world. I wonder if your firm was involved in building that, Claudio, because everywhere I went, I was looking at the design of learning spaces. I had many different layouts, and I was taking it to look at and be part of several classrooms just to observe. But it was just, if you ever go to Egypt, you want to see the pyramids, you want to see the Sphinx, you want to see the National Museum, but go to the American University of Cairo if you're interested in learning spaces, because that just blew me away, what was being done there, and the comfort level in the environments that were created. I mean, they had orchards, they were growing their own oranges on the campus, and other kinds of, and they had gardens that I was helping, they were planting things in their community gardens, and just the color contrast that were being used. The color makes a huge difference, right, Claudio, in terms of how one thinks about your performance and participation within these spaces, whether it's pink or blue or some other colors. Anyways, Claudio, you want to take make the last comment for us?
Well, my last comment is that I'm super grateful to be here, and again, thank you so much for this opportunity. It has been also an occasion for me to hear, your perspective, and I think it was so important to have this Q&A session as well. As often when I do these presentations, it's more about me speaking. So I love that today we had a little bit more of an interaction, and I want to continue, if possible, to be in touch and to share our knowledge, and as much as possible, you can inspire me with all of the places you've been and all of the buildings you've seen, so that I can also in turn enrich my little knowledge and my little presentation somehow.
You've done a lot to help to make a difference in the world of learning and everybody's lives, and all those buildings you've been part of and your firms have been part of. So it's an honor for us to take this hour and 20 minutes or more, 20 out of your impactful days, and to share that with us. And this is being recorded. I will send you the link after. When we get it processed, I'll be putting this up for the people who aren't here today, because there's quite a few people that say they want to watch this episode. So let's give Claudio a round of applause. And I think this is the first class in my 3 decades of teaching where I've had 2 Claudios in the same class. You know, so yeah, I'm going to stop the recording of week 8 right now.